It came low across the snowfield in hard, steady sheets, scouring the ground until the surface looked polished like bone. Daylight made everything cruelly visible. No soft shadows, no mercy, only glare that turned distance into a shimmer and near things into sharp edges. Somewhere in that white nothingness, a generator thumped with a tired rhythm. The sound carried oddly in the cold, like it didn't want to travel but had no choice. The field hospital squatted in the open like a stubborn thought no one could erase. Canvas tents stitched together with rope and snow-stiffened seams. A timber-framed triage bay braced with 2x4s, sandbags half buried in drifts. A Red Cross tarp snapped and flapped against its lashings, the symbol smeared with frost and grime. Supplies sat in stacked crates under a lean-to, half covered by a blanket that had turned rigid as a plank. One ambulance sled and a single armored truck sat angled into the wind, exhaust pluming, as if they were also trying to keep warm. In a place like this, the idea of neutrality was a thin story people told themselves. The first burst of gunfire tore the story apart. It started from the left, tree-lean and rock fingers that broke through the snow like knuckles. Muzzle flashes were brief, almost delicate, swallowed by daylight. The bullets weren't delicate. They snapped through canvas, punched into stacked crates, spat chips from frozen timber. The sound came in layers, the crack of rifles, then the slap of impact, then the echo rolling off ridge lines. Men in mixed uniforms, convoy escort and local guards, reacted on training and instinct. Two dropped to a knee and tried to find the source. One shouted directions that nobody could hear properly over the wind and gunfire. Another dragged a wounded soldier by the webbing, boots skidding on crusted snow. It took seconds for the geometry to reveal itself, and when it did, it was ugly. The hospital sat in a shallow bowl near a frozen riverbed. Two ridgelines and a rock spine formed a natural funnel. The enemy had the higher ground by just enough. They didn't need cliffs. They didn't need towers. They had angle, and angle was everything. The security detail had open snow and scattered supply piles, cover that was more suggestion than protection. The insurgents used snow berms and glare to close distance in short runs, dropping into depressions, moving like they had practiced the route. The escort sergeant, mid-30s, battered face, the kind of calm that came from seeing too much, jammed his radio handset against his ear. Falcon Actual, this is Mercy 1. Troops in contact. Request immediate. Static answered him. Not ordinary static either. It was thick, aggressive, as if something was actively eating the signal. He tried a second channel, then a third. The noise changed pitch, but never became words. He looked up at the sky, instinctively searching for the invisible thread of help that satellites and relays were supposed to provide. The thread wasn't there. Radio's dead, someone yelled. Try the sat. Sat's down too. The sergeant felt a cold weight settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the wind. This wasn't a random hit and run. This was an opportunist taking a shot at a soft target. Someone had brought a hammer to break their communications before they even started breaking bodies. Inside the triage tent, the air was warmer, thick with the smell of antiseptic and blood, and a different kind of urgency. A heater hissed. A medic's hands shook as he fumbled with a tourniquet. A wounded man on a stretcher stared upward with wide, unfocused eyes, breath puffing in small clouds because the canvas didn't keep all the cold out. Near his head, a nurse leaned in, voice low and steady. Look at me, she said, and the man's eyes twitched toward her. Breathe with me. In, out. Good. Stay with me. She wore scrubs beneath a heavy jacket, her hair tucked tight under a cap. No unit patch. No rank displayed. No weapon slung across her chest like an identity. She was the kind of person people saw as part of the scenery in places like this. Essential, but not central. A support beam. Quiet. Competent. Replaceable, if you listen to the way some talked. Her hands were the opposite of replaceable. They moved with calm precision over the wounded man's chest, checking the seal on a dressing, pressing just enough, not wasting motion. Outside, bullets hammered the world. Inside, She kept her voice even, her breathing controlled, as if she could lend him her steadiness by proximity. A second stretcher came in, carried by two soldiers who looked like they'd been dragged through the snow behind a vehicle. The man on it screamed as his leg bumped the tent pole. Blood seeped through his trousers and turned black in the cold. "Over here!" a medic shouted. The nurse didn't look up right away. She finished what she was doing, secured the dressing, then turned with a snap of focus that made the medic's panic seem loud. "Pressure here," she told him, placing his hand precisely. "Don't lift. Don't peek. Hold." Then she moved to the new casualty. The first RPG whoosh sounded like the air being torn open. Somewhere outside, a hostile team had set up with a tube angled toward the tents. The blast rocked the snow. A shock wave rattled the timber braces. The heater hiccuped and sputtered. Someone screamed. Dust and frost drifted down from the canvas ceiling. Panic surged like a living thing. Medics grabbed their patients and dragged them deeper into the tent. Someone knocked over a tray of instruments. Metal clattered, too bright, too loud. Through the tent flap, daylight flashed white and violet. The nurse's face didn't change much. Her eyes narrowed, listening, separating sounds, rifle fire, wind, movement, the hollow thump of explosives. A series of shouted orders cut through the chaos outside. Short, sharp, in a dialect the local liaison had been translating all week. The words were urgent, purposeful, not the wild yelling of men firing for revenge. This was command. She heard one phrase clearly enough to understand its shape, even if she didn't speak the language fluently. It had the cadence of a target name, a direction, a priority, and she saw something, too, through a gap in the canvas where a bullet had punched a neat hole. A flicker of movement on the ridgeline that didn't match the others. A man with a handset crouched beside a box and an antenna, his head bent like a technician. Two guards near him didn't fire much. They watched. They protected. Her gaze stayed on that small knot of figures for one heartbeat, longer than a normal nurse would allow herself. Then she turned back to the wounded man in front of her and made herself calm again, like she was closing a door. Outside, the security detail buckled under angle and volume. The armored truck's mounted gun roared in short bursts, the gunner cursing as he tried to control recoil on icy ground. The sound was reassuring for half a second, the familiar thunder of heavy rounds. Then the gun stuttered, coughed, and stopped. The gunner slapped the feed, worked the mechanism with gloved hands that were suddenly too clumsy, too slow. Overheating. A jam. In a fight like this, it didn't matter which. It was failure. The insurgents took the pause like a breath and pushed. They came in squads, moving in rehearsed bounds, dropping behind berms, popping up to fire and suppress. A pair on the right sprinted toward the comms corner where the hospital's small antenna mast stood, thin metal against huge sky. Another cluster angled toward a separate tent set slightly apart. The senior doctor's shelter, marked by a faded tarp and an extra guard. The escort sergeant's eyes tracked them and narrowed. He saw it. The enemy wasn't spreading fire evenly. They weren't just trying to kill. They were shaping a path. "Protect the dock," he shouted. "Keep them off the comms." Someone fired back. "Radio's dead." "I know." The sergeant snapped, pain flaring as he moved. His arm was slick with blood from a graze. "Doesn't matter. They want something. Don't let them take it." A local guard went down, thigh hit, screaming. Snow sprayed under him as he fell. Two medics tried to reach him and were pinned by a burst that stitched the ground in front of their boots. They crouched, trapped behind a crate, eyes wide. Then, without warning, two insurgents dropped in rapid succession. Not sprayed down, not hammered by a burst. Dropped cleanly, like someone had cut their strings. One had been mid-run, rifle up, mouth open. He folded and slid into the snow. The other had been crouched behind a berm, firing short, controlled bursts. His head snapped sideways, and he fell backward, leaving his rifle pointed at empty sky. For half a second, the battlefield paused, not because the wind stopped or the pain stopped, but because the enemy's confidence hesitated. Everyone looked for the source. The security detail, the medics, even the insurgents, briefly, turned their faces toward ridgeline and tree lean. But there was nothing obvious. No flash, no silhouette, no smoke. Only the glare and the endless white. A medic near the triage tent swallowed hard. Did we hit them? The escort sergeant didn't answer. His eyes narrowed further. He watched the pattern, not just who fell, but who had been about to do what. The insurgents recovered quickly. They assumed luck. They assumed coincidence. They pushed harder. Suppressive fire intensified, bracketing the hospital with snapping rounds that kicked snow into small explosions. Bullets tore through canvas. People flinched. Wounded men cried out. The smell of cordite mixed with antiseptic until both seemed wrong. On the ridgeline, a man in a scarf raised a handset and gestured sharply, his other hand chopping the air as if he could slice the world into obedient pieces. He never finished the gesture. A shot, sharp, singular, cut through the roar. The man's knees buckled, and he pitched forward. The handset fell into the snow. For a fraction of a second, the static in the escort sergeant's radio shifted. A stutter, a brief thinning, almost words. Then the jamming returned, heavier than before, like a hand tightening. The sergeant's breath caught. Someone's picking them, he muttered, more to himself than anyone. Not random. They're climbing the ladder. What? A private shouted, crawling behind a crate. The sergeant didn't have time to explain. His brain was doing it anyway, mapping targets like dots. Radio operator, RPG team, whoever was coordinating. Someone out there understood the battlefield the way a commander did. Understood that you didn't have to kill everyone, only the right ones. Inside the triage tent, the nurse paused with her fingers on a pulse point. She looked up at the canvas flap as it shuddered under another impact. Her expression was controlled, but there was a flicker beneath it, something like recognition, something like decision warming under ice. Outside, a medic looked up toward the bright, empty ridge and whispered, as if saying it louder might invite the answer to shoot him too. Who's shooting? No one answered. The outer perimeter went. An insurgent slammed a shoulder into a sandbag wall and toppled it. Another kicked open the small gate made of pallets and wire. The main entrance flap of the field hospital snapped violently as someone yanked it aside. Daylight poured into the triage like a blade. The sound of boots hit the threshold. Voices surged, harsh and close. The violence was about to spill into the wounded, where people couldn't run and couldn't fight and couldn't even lift their own heads. The nurse's hand stayed steady. 18 hours earlier, the same snow region had looked almost peaceful. Daylight had faded into pale blue, the kind of twilight that made everything softer without making it any warmer. The hospital had been busy then too, but busy in a predictable way. Frostbite cases, sprains, a patrolman with a cracked rib who insisted he was fine until the doctor pressed, and he yelped. The generator had hummed. The heater had hissed. People had joked with the kind of forced lightness that came when you were far from home and needed to pretend you weren't. The nurse had arrived late, transferred in quietly with a thin packet of papers and a duffel that didn't look like it held much. She'd been assigned to cover a shortage, night shift, mostly. Someone had glanced at the assignment list, shrugged, and said, better than nothing. She had not corrected them. She'd introduced herself simply, first name only, then gone to work without waiting for anyone to make space for her. She had a way of moving that didn't demand attention. She didn't apologize for existing either. She just fit where she needed to fit, like water. A young infantry corporal had watched her check in, eyes lingering on the scrubs under her jacket. Hey, he called, half-grin on his face. You lost? The spa is 2 valleys over. A few chuckles. Not cruel, exactly, but dismissive in the way men were when they needed the world to stay in categories. Fighters and non-fighters. She'd looked at him, not offended, just measuring. If I'm lost, she'd said, you'll be the first one to tell me where you are when you're bleeding. That had earned a louder laugh, and the corporal had lifted his hands. Fair. A medic, a tired specialist with dark circles under his eyes, had pulled her aside and lowered his voice as if he were giving life-saving advice. If anything kicks off, he'd told her, you stay inside. We've got security. Your job is patience. She nodded. Understood. She hadn't added, your definition of anything is narrower than mine. She did the unglamorous work. Inventorying trauma kits, swapping floor warmers, checking generator fuel, marking blood types on bags with careful block letters, clearing snow off intake vents so the heater wouldn't choke. The rhythm of the tasks was domestic, almost like maintaining a house in the middle of nowhere. It gave the staff something to cling to, routine as a talisman against chaos. And all the while, her eyes kept doing something else. She adjusted the angle of a tent flap so it didn't catch glare and flash like a signal mirror. She watched spindrift skitter across the ground and knew which way the wind would push smoke if they ever needed it. She asked casually, as if it were part of logistics, "What's our line of sight to the North Ridge?" and got a shrug in response. "Why?" the medic had asked. "Security," she'd said. He'd waved a hand. "We're a hospital." She'd accepted that answer like you accepted a child telling you monsters weren't real, kindly, without agreement. The escort element was thin. One squad, one vehicle with a mounted gun, 2 local guards hired for familiarity with the terrain, and a liaison who spoke the languages that mattered. They expected harassment, shots from distance, maybe a probe at night, something that could be driven off. They didn't expect a deliberate assault. That was what the flags and red crosses were for, in theory. A signal to anyone with a conscience or a calculation that some lines were not worth crossing. The liaison, an older man with a weathered face, didn't believe in the flags the way the others did. He believed in patterns. Comms were already unreliable due to terrain. Hills and ridges ate signals. The satellite link was temperamental, dropping out when clouds thickened. A storm cycle was forecast, and everyone joked about it until they stopped joking because the cold wasn't funny anymore. Ammo resupply was delayed. The escort leader counted magazines with a frown and told his men, "We're light until the next drop." Short bursts. No hero stuff. The nurse heard that too. She didn't comment. She just filed it away as another constraint in a list that was growing. Late that evening, while the camp settled into the brittle quiet that came between generator hum and distant wind, she moved through the supply stacks with the ease of someone who belonged there. She lifted blankets, shifted boxes, and checked a lock-hard case tucked among medical crates. It didn't look military at first glance. No markings, no stickers, just a plain case with scuffed corners. She ran her fingers along the latch as if ensuring it hadn't been disturbed. No one noticed. They were busy living in their assumptions. A local teen runner arrived breathless just before full dark, cheeks red from cold, eyes wide from fear. He spoke fast, hands gesturing toward the hills. The liaison grabbed him by the shoulders, listened, then turned toward the escort sergeant with a tight jaw. "Strangers," the liaison said, "in the hills, asking questions, asking about the doctor, and the radio box." The sergeant frowned. "Radio box." The liaison hesitated, as if translating not just words but intent. "The thing you talk with. The antenna. The equipment." The nurse stood a little behind them, holding a clipboard. She watched the liaison's face, not the runner's. She saw fear there, yes, but also something else, recognition. Like he'd seen this kind of question before, somewhere else, and the memory had teeth. The sergeant thanked the runner, gave him food, sent him back with a warning to stay away. Then he turned and told his squad to double the watch, to keep eyes on the ridges, to be ready. People took it seriously for about 20 minutes, then the routine returned. Heaters needed fuel. Patients needed checks. The cold pressed in. Later, when everyone else was inside, the nurse took a walk to the edge of camp. Not far, just enough to feel the open snow under her boots and the sky above her. Huge and different. She stood where the hospital lights faded and scanned the ridge lines the way a hunter scanned a clearing. Her eyes traced the rock spine, the tree-lean, the shallow bowl they sat in. She didn't need a map to see the funnel. She didn't need anyone's permission to understand what it meant. In the present, with daylight cutting hard and bullets snapping through canvas, that understanding became action. The breach at the entrance flap brought the fight into the hospital's throat. An insurgent lunged in, rifle sweeping, eyes hungry. Behind him, another shoved forward, shouting something that made the liaison's face go pale. The nurse heard it clearly this time. "Take the doctor alive. Not kill. Not burn. Take." A targeted raid. A capture. A filmed victory waiting to happen. The escort sergeant outside couldn't see inside, but he felt the pressure shift, the way you felt a predator commit to the pounce. He shouted again for someone, anyone, to get the doctor out, to protect the comms, to hold. The mounted gun on the vehicle clattered back into life for 2 seconds, then jammed again. The gunner screamed a curse that was half rage, half fear. Civilians, 2 women and a child who'd been sheltering near the supply lean-to, ran in panic, stumbling through the snow, and insurgents used them the way competent killers used anything, as moving clutter, as moral friction, as shields that forced defenders to hesitate. A medic tried to raise his rifle, then lowered it as the child stumbled into his line. His mouth moved, silent, like he was praying. That half-second of hesitation was all an enemy needed. The nurse, in the triage tent, finished handing off a critical patient. She locked eyes with the tired medic who had told her to stay inside. He looked at her now like he was seeing her for the first time. Not as a nurse. As a person making a decision he didn't understand. "Stay," he began, voice cracking. She didn't argue. She didn't waste time explaining. She simply touched his shoulder, a steadying pressure, and said, "Keep them alive." Then she moved. She slipped through a gap between tents, keeping low as bullets stitched canvas and snow. The air outside hit her like a slap, cold so sharp it felt like a reprimand. She moved with controlled speed, not a sprint that would draw eyes, but not slow either. Purposeful, invisible in the way that mattered. The liaison saw her and grabbed her sleeve. "No," he shouted. "Inside, inside." She turned her head toward him, eyes calm, and in that calm, there was something that made him release her without understanding why. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't reckless courage. It was certainty, the kind that came from already having walked this path in her mind. She reached the supply stacks. She yanked the blanket aside. Her fingers found the hard case latch. For a fraction of a second, she hesitated, not because she was afraid of the enemy, but because of what opening that case meant. Once it was open, the story she'd been living here, quiet nurse, late transfer, support staff, would be over. Once it was open, a different story would start. And stories like that always had costs. Another RPG whoosh cut through the air, closer this time, and canvas snapped under the pressure wave. Somewhere, a wounded man screamed. The nurse exhaled, long and controlled, as if letting go of something inside herself. She popped the latch. Inside, wrapped in sterile cloth like a perverse parody of her day job, were compact precision rifle components. A small optic, a few carefully packed magazines. Nothing excessive, nothing flashy. The kind of kit someone carried when they didn't plan to waste shots. She assembled fast. No flourish, no drama. The pieces fit together like they'd been in her hands 1,000 times. Her fingers moved with muscle memory that didn't belong to a nurse. A young medic rounding the corner saw the rifle and froze. His face went blank, then shifted into stunned comprehension. He started and couldn't finish. She didn't look at him. Her attention was on the snowfield, the ridgeline, the angle. She checked the optic, felt the rifle's weight settle into her shoulder like an old burden. She counted rounds. Limited. Enough for decisions, not for battles. She couldn't trade shots. She couldn't get into a duel. Every trigger press had to remove a force multiplier. That wasn't a tactic. It was survival math. The route she chose wasn't heroic. It was ugly and cold and low. A frozen drainage ditch ran along the edge of the hospital's shallow bowl, half hidden by snow berms and canvas clutter. It wasn't deep enough to be safe, but it was deep enough to break a line of sight if you moved at the right moments. She slid into it on her belly, rifle hugged close, and began to crawl. Above her, bullets snapped overhead. Snow dust drifted down into her collar. The wind pushed spindrift across the ditch in small waves that threatened to fill it. Glare off the snow made optics tricky. The world was too bright, too flat. Shadows mattered more than shapes. She timed her movement with wind gusts, letting spindrift rise and blur her outline. She used the hospital's chaos as cover. Everyone's eyes were forward toward the immediate threat, not down into a ditch where a nurse should not have been. Her optic fogged briefly, the cold biting moisture into the glass. A battery indicator flickered low. She pressed the optic against her body for a second, warming it through layers, then wiped the lens with a cloth from her medical kit. One more repurposed tool. Protocol and improvisation braided together. She passed wounded men and fighting men who barely registered her. A soldier huddled behind a crate, hands shaking as he tried to reload. His eyes flicked toward her scrubs and then away, dismissing her as someone out of place, a non-combatant moving in panic. That dismissal was armor. She crawled past him like a shadow. The drainage ditch angled toward the rock spine. Ahead, a half-collapsed storage lean-to leaned against a boulder, its roof sagging under ice. Beyond it, a narrow slit between rocks offered a view that most would miss. A slice of ridgeline where command tended to gather, where men who thought themselves safe liked to point and talk. An impossible angle. She eased into position, rifle resting on packed snow. The world narrowed. The roar of gunfire became background. Her breathing slowed, controlled. The same discipline she used to calm patients now turned inward. Through the optic, the ridgeline resolved. She saw the jammer setup, a field box with an antenna, guarded by two men who weren't firing much, only watching. Nearby, a spotter scanned with binoculars. A little higher, a small drone buzzed, drifting like a mechanical insect against the pale sky, its camera angling down toward the hospital. The enemy wasn't blind. They were making sure the defenders stayed blind. And she saw the push lane toward the doctor's shelter, men moving with intent, not spray. The capture plan was real. She whispered, barely audible, not to anyone else but to Anchor herself. Make them blind first. Then she took her first deliberate shot. The recoil was controlled. The sound was a single sharp crack swallowed by wind and distance. Through the optic, she saw the spotter's head snap back. He fell, binoculars tumbling into snow. She shifted immediately, just a meter, just enough to change the angle that any counterspotter might be searching. She didn't linger. She didn't admire. She worked. The next target was a runner, a man moving between squads on the ridge, waving his arms and hand signals. He was an ode, a living radio. One shot. He crumpled. Down at the hospital, suppressive fire slackened for half a second, not because anyone chose to be merciful, but because a piece of their machine had stopped. The nurse found the RPG gunner lining up toward the triage tent, his tube angled, his body hunched with concentration. She waited until he committed, until his focus narrowed to the hospital and he stopped scanning. One shot. The RPG tube dipped. The gunner collapsed sideways, breath and blood steaming in the cold. Inside the triage tent, a medic flinched as if expecting the rocket's impact. When it didn't come, he looked up, confused, then back down at his patient with renewed urgency. The nurse tracked the drone control, a man with a handset, eyes on a screen, hands making small adjustments. She wasn't sure she could kill a drone with a rifle at this distance with limited ammo. Better to sever the hand that guided it. One shot. The man slumped. The drone drifted, lost, then began to wander, its search pattern degrading. The enemy's volume of fire faltered again. Not by much, but enough. Constraint stack pressed in. Her barrel warmed. The wind shifted. Spindrift blew into her slit view, briefly obscuring her sight picture. Ammo count ticked down in her head like a clock you couldn't silence. She couldn't stay on the same sight line. The enemy was competent. They would notice. They would adapt. They did. At first, they'd assumed shots came from the hospital, defenders firing back with luck. Then they saw the angle, bodies dropping a line that didn't match the hospital's firing points. A flank. A hidden shooter. A squad broke off from the assault and started moving toward the drainage line, low and fast, using the same snow berm she had. Counterhunt. Above, the drone, still in the air, still dangerous, even drifting, shifted to a thermal sweep, angling toward likely sniper hides. Another pair of insurgents began climbing along rocks to gain a higher angle on the rock spine, trying to get above her position. A third team started blind firing into boulders and lean-tos, sending chips of stone and snow into the air. The nurse moved in micro moves. Shoot, breathe, slide, reset. She kept her profile low, her clothing blending into shadow and snow dirt. When a rock splintered and scraped her knuckles, she didn't curse. She pressed a strip of tape from her kit over the cut, sealed it like she would seal a wound on someone else, then returned to the optic. Fear lived in her chest. It would have been unnatural if it didn't. The difference was she didn't let it drive. She let it inform. She let it sharpen. She searched for the brain and found him. Near the jammer, slightly behind the firing line, a man crouched with a map board and a phone, pointing men toward the doctor's shelter. Others leaned toward him, listening. He wasn't the loudest. He didn't need to be. His hand gestures were small, precise. The whole assault moved when he moved. The nurse steadied her aim. A civilian, one of the women from earlier, stumbled near that cluster, her arms raised, shoved forward by an insurgent like a human curtain. The commander shifted behind her, using her to move position safely. The nurse's finger rested on the trigger. The shot was there, almost. She could take it through the chaos and call it necessity. She could accept collateral as attacks. She didn't. She held. Patience under time pressure felt like torture. Every second she waited meant more rounds hitting canvas near wounded men, more chances for a breach, more blood she might have to try to stop with hands that were also holding a rifle. But she waited until the commander stepped clear, leaning forward to shout an order. Just a moment, just a small arrogance, thinking the ridge belonged to him. The nurse exhaled. One shot. The commander dropped, as if the ground had been pulled from him. The effect was immediate and visible even at distance. Men around him froze, not understanding why he'd fallen. Someone crouched to grab him. Someone else looked around wildly. Hand signals stopped. The assault's rhythm faltered. Coordination fractured. And near the jammer, panic flickered. A man at the field box began fumbling with it, hands moving faster than skill. He was trying to adjust, to boost, to compensate. The nurse didn't give him time. One shot. He folded over the box. For the first time, the escort sergeant's radio crackled. Static thinned. A voice cut through, broken but real. Mercy 1, say again. The sergeant's eyes widened. Hope hit him like a punch. He grabbed the handset and shouted into it, forcing calm into his voice. Falcon Actual, Mercy 1, troops in contact, field hospital under assault, jammer compromised, but still intermittent, request immediate QRF. Marking with smoke. His words weren't perfect, but they existed. In a fight where isolation had been a death sentence, existence was everything. He turned to his squad, voice snapping into command. Smoke. Now. Push left, secure the dock, and pull casualties to the truck. Move. Friendly forces exploited the opening like they'd been waiting their whole lives for permission. A smoke grenade hissed and spat white cloud that merged with spindrift, creating a curtain. Two soldiers sprinted toward the doctor's shelter, rifles up, dragging a wounded man by his collar. Medics used the slackened fire lanes to haul a casualty behind sandbags without losing him to a burst. The enemy tried to recover. They surged forward with heavier fire, desperation pushing them into motion. A group sprinted toward the hospital entrance to salvage the capture attempt. But without cohesion, their movement was clumsy. They bunching up. They exposed themselves. They shouted over one another. The nurse tracked the final RPG thread. Another gunner, this one more cautious, trying to get a shot off before the window closed. One shot. He dropped. A squad leader, distinct by posture and confidence, rose to wave men forward. The nurse took him too. The body fell, and the men behind him hesitated, suddenly leaderless, suddenly unsure. Her ammo was low enough now that she could feel each remaining round like a weight. She went silent, not because the fight was over, but because she'd done what she could do best. Break the enemy's force multipliers, crack their spine, make them blind and clumsy. The counterhunt squad reached the drainage line. They fired into it, bullets snapping into packed snow. One climbed up onto a berm to get angle. The nurse had already shifted back, deeper behind a lean-to, her body pressed to cold earth, rifle hugged close. She watched boots move past within a dozen meters, close enough she could see frost on fabric. Her pulse thudded in her ears, loud as gunfire in the silence of her hiding. Fear asked her to shoot, to end the immediate threat. Function told her the math. If she fired now, she'd reveal herself to men within grenade distance. She had limited ammo. Her job wasn't to win a personal duel. Her job was to keep the hospital alive long enough for rescue. She waited. The boots passed. The men moved on, searching the wrong shadow, chasing a ghost she refused to become. In the distance, faint at first, a sound rose above wind. A thump, then another. Rotors. The QRF helicopter crested the far ridge like a dark insect against white sky, moving fast, purposeful. Behind it, a second shape. Maybe another aircraft, maybe a ground vehicle's dustless plume, hinted at reinforcement. The enemy heard it too. They looked up. Their assault wavered, then began to break apart as men scattered toward treeline and rocks, trying to avoid being trapped in open snow. The escort sergeant let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He didn't celebrate. He just kept shouting orders, moving men, pulling wounded, holding the line until the arriving force could take over. When it was finally over, when the last shots faded, when the helicopter's downwash kicked snow into a storm around the tents, when the surviving insurgents melted into the terrain they had used so well, silence returned in pieces. It wasn't clean silence. It was a silence full of ringing ears, sobbing breaths, and the distant, steady thump of the generator that had never stopped. Bodies were zipped. Tents were patched with tape and spare canvas. Blood-stained snow was shoveled into piles because leaving it where people walked felt like admitting something too heavy. Higher command arrived with clipped voices and tight faces. They apologized for the comms blackout, but the apology sounded like a report, not regret. It confirmed what everyone already knew. The jamming had been deliberate, set up with intent, protected like a crown jewel. Someone had come prepared to isolate them, to make sure no help arrived until it was too late. In the debrief, under the clean, harsh light of day, motive surfaced like a shape under ice. The insurgents hadn't attacked a hospital because they hated medicine. They'd attacked because the senior doctor had treated someone important weeks earlier, an injured militant who'd been moved through villages like a rumor. The doctor had recognized him, documented his injuries, logged evidence that tied leadership to crimes and foreign support. Information that could become prosecutions, or leverage, or propaganda, depending on who got to tell the story first. They wanted him alive, not to negotiate kindly, to parade him, to force him to recant, to erase what he'd recorded by making the recorder disappear. The liaison admitted, quietly, that he'd seen this playbook before. Targeted abductions disguised as raids. Jammers to delay response. Cameras ready to film the victory and feed it to networks that paid in money and influence. The Red Cross on the tarp wasn't a shield to men who saw symbols as tools. Someone asked about the impossible shots and the tent went still. The escort sergeant's gaze drifted toward the nurse, who stood a little apart, hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from. Her knuckles were taped where skin had split. Her face was calm in the aftermath the same way it had been calm in triage, but her eyes looked older, as if a door had closed behind them. A young corporal, the one who joked about spas, couldn't meet her gaze. He stared at the floor like it might open and swallow him. The sergeant cleared his throat. "You walked the perimeter last night," he said, not accusing, just stating. She nodded once. "You knew that drainage route." "I saw it," she said. "You didn't tell us." Asked about lines of sight, she replied, still calm. No one listened. No one argued with that. Paperwork happened the way paperwork always happened after events like this. Forms to satisfy rules that pretended rules could keep up with reality. Unauthorized weapon possession. Unreported capability. Violation of protocol. The nurse accepted the reprimand without protest. It was ink. It wasn't the point. The point was that the same people who signed the paper also quietly ensured the case didn't end up in the wrong hands. The escort sergeant made a phone call. The liaison spoke to someone in a low voice. The doctor himself, pale, shaken, alive, stood in front of a staff officer and said flatly, "If you punish her beyond paperwork, you can explain to the families why I'm here to treat their sons at all." Respect didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with small changes. The medic who had told her to stay inside stopped calling her night shift and started using her name with care. The corporal offered her his seat without making a joke. The local guards nodded at her, as if acknowledging a truth they'd sensed but never named. The escort sergeant approached her near the triage tent as she checked a patient's dressing, hands steady again, returning to the work that had always been her cover and her choice. He hesitated, then said, "What do I call you?" She didn't look up. "Nurse," she replied. He nodded. "Nurse," he repeated, and in the way he said it, the word changed shape, from dismissal to respect, from category to earned title. Later, when the hospital lights glowed against the snow and the wind returned to its steady, merciless sweep, people moved more quietly. Not because they were afraid to make noise, but because they now understood what silence could hide. In the bright snow, where nothing should have been able to disappear, the quietest person had been the one who kept them alive.